Good morning. It is filled to the brim, and it is Tuesday, November 23rd. What a week. We're on Thanksgiving week, and we need to be thankful unto Him and bless His name. You know, we've been talking about divine change, and today I want to continue with that subject actually throughout the week. God is moving, and there has been a shaking, and with that shaking comes His divine change. You know, everything that is not of His kingdom is going to be shaken and fall away, but we have received a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Hebrews 12:28. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. But you know what? If we're holding on to the things of this world, if we're holding on to structures and things around us that are not of His kingdom, those things are going to be shaken, and it's actually testing us, and it's actually revealing to us what we're holding on to rather than the things of God. So we embrace His shaking so that we are purified. Divine change happens during this shaking time. And we've been talking about some people who experienced divine change, specifically looking at the Old Testament. And we looked at Abraham and Sarah, and we looked at Joseph. And Joseph had a ton of change in his life. So much change. And as a result of being sold into slavery by his brothers, he goes to Potiphar's house, then he ends up in prison, and then he ends up in the palace. And what a great experience to know that all this change that he had a reason. There was a purpose for it, a divine purpose. And finally his brothers and his father come to the palace. He is preserving and saving not only the nation of Israel, but also other people groups. So there was a purpose for Joseph's change. But before we move on from Joseph, I really felt like we had to address one important component. See, his changes and were not, his desire, his changes challenged his integrity. He had tests, and he, as a result of his testing and his overcoming of those tests, he functions in the supernatural power of God. This started when he was a young man at 17. He ends up in the palace at 30 years old, so he has 13 years of basic misery of being tested and refined by God so that he becomes the leader needed. But there's also a test. After he becomes second in command and in the palace, and his brothers and his father come, there's also a test. There's the test of forgiveness. Now, when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, he's kind of tested his brothers to see if they've changed and all of that. He reveals himself to his brothers in Genesis 45, 4-8. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you for a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God." Now, I want you to look at this. Joseph has initiated the concept, the truth, the experience of forgiveness. He is telling his brothers, "I have forgiven you." And this reveals where Joseph has this spiritual maturity, his journey of spiritual maturity. He has embraced the change, he's embraced the purpose, and he is telling his brothers that he forgives them. And his brothers go and they get the father, and Joseph has this wonderful reconciliation with his father because his father thought he was dead and he's alive. So it's a beautiful thing. Now, so Joseph initiates forgiveness with his brothers. But it shows that, listen, he has already had the journey within himself, that spiritual maturity to be a forgiving person. But there's a revisiting of this forgiveness. Now, With divine change, we have opportunities to forgive. Sometimes we say, I've already forgiven that situation. I've already gone through that. I've already forgiven. And yet the subject comes up again. The subject of whatever it is that you need to forgive. This happens actually in Joseph's life. His father dies. After his father dies, the subject of forgiveness comes up again. This time, the brothers bring up the subject of forgiveness. There is a sense of vulnerability that they have with Joseph. And so Joseph now once again has to revisit forgiveness. Genesis 50:15 through 21. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way, he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. Now, remember, I just read to you Genesis 45, when Joseph initiates the forgiveness, and then he has his father come, and they all come and dwell with him in Egypt. Now the father has died, and the issue, the concept of forgiveness comes up. Joseph is once again challenged to forgive. See, a lot of times we think that we don't have to revisit forgiveness. You know, circumstances, maybe a life-change event like a parent dying, something big happening in your life, and all of a sudden that same thing that you thought was taken care of, and not that it wasn't, but there's new information, there's new layer that has been exposed, let's say, a new layer of exposure that you have to go back to that and say, you know what, I have forgiven them. I have once again addressing forgiveness. And in order for Joseph to launch forward again in his authority, in how God is going to use him, because God is not done using Joseph in Egypt after his father dies. Joseph will still have a long trajectory of leadership in Egypt, and yet this is now another pivotal time for Joseph to say, I embrace forgiveness. I embrace this a new level of forgiveness that I didn't even know that I needed. And here again, the subject comes up. A lot of times, rather than denying it, maybe even getting a little self-righteous or super spiritual, when those things come up, emotions, conversations, a lot of times in the holiday times, those things come up. We are to once again let the flow of forgiveness be released from our lives once again. Maybe the person that you've already forgiven needs to talk about it again, and you reassure them of the forgiveness. What it does for you, it simply launches you forward in greater authority. And that's what happens in Joseph's life. If you look at Joseph's life as he moves forward, we see that Joseph dies at 110 years old. That means that he was in authority in Egypt for 80 years. He came in authority at 30 and he dies at 110. We also know that Israel, the people of Israel, Jacob's sons, Joseph's brothers, live in Egypt for 430 years. Not until the king's change and all that happens that they become slaves in Egypt. You know, it's interesting because it's not only Joseph's life, but the memory of Joseph, his reputation, the honor of Joseph in Egypt is fairly lasting for a few hundred years until we read in Exodus 1:8, that the new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt, that's when the Israelites become slaves and they go under hardship and they cry out to God. What do I want to say here? I want to say Joseph is a fantastic example of divine change. But he moves through it, not just so that he goes into authority and fulfills his purpose, but he moves forward in divine change within himself, in that he's growing spiritually, he's growing in forgiveness, he's growing in overcoming. His father prophesies over Joseph and the other sons, and he says of Joseph, Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring whose branches climb over a wall. In other words, he is an overcomer, and as a result of overcoming, he becomes powerful, and he keeps his vine near a spring. We know that the spring is the Holy Spirit, and he kept his life near the presence of God so that he can embrace all that God had for him, those divine changes that happened externally but also internally. You know what? Pray about this word. Do you need to forgive? Maybe you're revisiting an issue that you said, I've forgiven, but God is saying, you know what? There's a new layer to forgive so that I can launch you into greater change and greater authority. God bless you. Pray about this word.